They were seen as noble heroes, symbols of honor, bravery, and chivalry. But behind the shining armor and epic tales lies a far darker story. Medieval knights weren't always the protectors we imagine. In fact, some of their deepest secrets reveal a brutal, violent, and deeply human side history rarely talks about. This isn't the romantic version from fairy tales. These are the truths they tried to keep buried. Here are 10 dark secrets medieval knights didn't want you to know. Number 1. The hidden bloodlust of chivalry. The popular image of medieval knights as paragons of virtue, self-discipline, and chivalric honor masks a much darker reality that many historical sources, both contemporary and modern, help bring into sharper focus. While knights were indeed bound by a code of conduct, one that extolled loyalty, justice, and protection of the innocent, this code was often more of an ideal than a lived reality. Underneath the layers of oaths and ceremonial rituals, there was a fundamental truth that many knights were deeply drawn to violence not just as a profession, but as a personal obsession. Warfare was not only their duty, it was their identity, their proving ground, and in many cases, their addiction. Tournaments, which are frequently romanticized today as sportsmanlike contests of skill, were in their original form brutal, uncontrolled melees that bore little resemblance to the stylized jousts of later centuries. Participants were maimed or killed regularly, and in some regions, death was not just expected, it was desired. Victory brought fame, financial gain, and increased status, while survival itself became a mark of toughness and divine favor. Knights didn't simply fight, they relished the spectacle of battle. Chroniclers recount scenes of knights trampling over corpses in the mud, yelling with glee as they ran lances through chests or cracked skulls open with warhammers. These were not always defensive wars or righteous causes. Many knights actively sought out conflict because peace offered them little to do and even less glory. In some cases, the knights would provoke conflicts between rival lords or feud with neighbors over minor slights just to create opportunities for battle. Accounts of mock battles turning into real bloodshed weren't rare. Some knights treated these events as opportunities to refine their killing techniques. Combat was not just sanctioned violence, it was elevated to a cultural ideal, one that fostered an atmosphere where cruelty could easily be reframed as courage and bloodlust as honor. Even during campaigns such as the Crusades, where knights claimed spiritual motivations, personal ambitions often took precedence. The euphoric rush of slaughter, the trophy-taking, the chaos, all became part of a pattern of behavior that many knights sought and even missed during times of peace. Far from being reluctant killers, many of these men were molded by a system that glorified domination through force and gave them the tools and approval to pursue it freely. Their passion for battle was not always about protecting a cause. Often, it was simply about the irresistible lure of blood and power. Number 2. Brutality toward the peasantry. While the knightly class is often remembered for its supposed honor and loyalty, particularly in service to kings, popes, or abstract ideals like chivalry, what's less discussed is their daily relationship with the people they ruled over, the peasants. In feudal society, knights were more than armored warriors. They were landholders, power brokers, and enforcers of social order. This power gave them immense control over the peasantry, and in many cases they used that control with astonishing cruelty. For most peasants, daily life meant backbreaking agricultural labor under the constant threat of punishment. If a serf failed to meet a harvest quota, couldn't pay taxes, or resisted conscription, the knight had full legal authority to enact physical penalties. Flogging was commonplace, but harsher methods like branding, the removal of fingers, or even execution were not exceptional. It wasn't just legal, it was expected that knights would enforce discipline through violence. This wasn't viewed as cruelty, but as necessary governance in a system that equated order with obedience. Many knights saw peasants as inferior beings, tools meant for labor and service, not individuals with rights or dignity. There are recorded incidents where knights practiced sword techniques on the bodies of captured vagrants or criminals, treating them as expendable training materials. This wasn't condemned. In fact, such behavior could reinforce a knight's reputation as a fierce and effective lord. In regions plagued by frequent raids or instability, the peasantry were even conscripted into makeshift militias with no proper training, often used as cannon fodder while knights protected themselves behind layers of armor and mounted units. At times, entire villages were punished for the actions of one resident, subjected to starvation or destruction. In such a system, justice and brutality were indistinguishable. Knights maintained authority not through admiration, but through an ever-present threat of violence. The idealized image of knights as protectors becomes hard to reconcile when we acknowledge that for most of the population, those who lived in fields, not castles, knights represented fear, not safety. Their power was rarely tempered by mercy and often exercised without oversight. This wasn't an accidental outcome of the medieval hierarchy, it was an inherent feature of it. Number 3. Secret deals with the enemy. Behind the rigid vows of fealty and oaths of loyalty that medieval knights publicly declared, there existed a murky underworld of political manipulation, opportunistic betrayal, and covert negotiations with the very enemies they claimed to oppose. While chivalric codes promoted unwavering allegiance to one's lord or sovereign, the harsh reality of protracted conflict, shifting alliances, and personal ambition led many knights to make secret arrangements that would have been considered outright treason if exposed. These deals often took shape in the context of prolonged sieges, where supply shortages, low morale, and the fatigue of endless warfare created fertile ground for negotiation. It was not uncommon for knights to secretly accept bribes in exchange for information, access routes, or even intentional sabotage. There are accounts of gatekeepers being paid off to leave castle doors unlocked, or of soldiers instructed to feign disorganization during key moments in battle, all orchestrated by agreements made in shadowy tents or behind closed doors. This pattern of clandestine cooperation wasn't isolated to civil disputes. During the 100 Years' War, for example, several notable knights from both English and French factions were rumored to have communicated directly with enemy commanders, offering troop movements or battle plans in exchange for gold, land promises, or leniency should their side lose. These weren't necessarily acts of cowardice. They were often calculated moves to preserve family fortunes or political relevance. A knight who could secretly align himself with a rising power might later emerge not as a traitor, but as a survivor of a regime change. In crusading campaigns, these betrayals took on an even more complex form. While outwardly portrayed as holy wars, many knights used the Crusades as opportunities to gain wealth and personal power, regardless of the religious rhetoric that surrounded them. Some Christian knights sold arms, horses, or military intelligence directly to Muslim leaders. Others negotiated safe passage through hostile territory in exchange for gold, breaking the very vows they swore to uphold in the name of God. These secret dealings weren't the exception. They were part of the logic of survival and ambition in a time when loyalty was often a luxury. The knightly image of honor and steadfastness becomes difficult to accept when weighed against the repeated, well-documented instances of quiet betrayal, where personal gain consistently outweighed ideological commitment. Number 4. Exploitation during the Crusades. The popular narrative surrounding the medieval Crusades has long painted them as divinely sanctioned quests, driven by faith, sacrifice, and a collective Christian zeal to reclaim the Holy Land. However, beneath this ideological veneer lay a much grimmer truth. For a significant number of knights, the Crusades represented less a spiritual pilgrimage and more an unparalleled opportunity for personal enrichment, territorial expansion, and unrestrained violence under the protection of religious authority. The economic motivations were obvious from the outset. Many knights were second or third sons without inheritance prospects, burdened by debts, or seeking new titles and lands to elevate their social standing. The papal promise of absolution and spiritual rewards conveniently aligned with their desire to seize material wealth without facing moral scrutiny. What followed were decades of campaigns marked by looting, pillaging, and the systematic exploitation of both Muslim and Christian populations. Entire cities were sacked not for their strategic value, but for the gold locked inside their treasuries. Churches, monasteries, and sacred sites were desecrated by the very men who claimed to fight in the name of God. The Fourth Crusade, perhaps the most damning example, ended not in Jerusalem but in the brutal sacking of Constantinople, a Christian stronghold and cultural center. Driven by debt, greed, and internal manipulation, Western knights stormed the city, looted its churches, defiled relics, and slaughtered civilians. It was less a battle and more an orchestrated robbery carried out with military precision. The rhetoric of righteousness served as an effective shield. Knights routinely enslaved conquered populations, justified the kidnapping and selling of women and children as spoils of war, and extorted local rulers through the threat of violence disguised as divine justice. In many cases, supposed crusading leaders made secret pacts with rival factions, diverted expeditions for profit, and manipulated papal mandates for political leverage. This fusion of spiritual legitimacy with unchecked military power created an environment where abuse was not only common but systemically enabled. For many of these knights, the red cross sewn onto their surcoats was less a sign of devotion and more a license to commit acts that, in any other context, would have branded them as war criminals. The distinction between holy mission and calculated exploitation became so blurred that for many contemporary observers, it was impossible to tell where faith ended and opportunism began. The Crusades, in this light, become less about religious salvation and more about strategic plunder wrapped in sacred language. Number 5. Sexual violence as a weapon. Among the many disturbing truths buried beneath the polished armor and ceremonious oaths of medieval knighthood, few are as horrifying or systematically silenced as the use of sexual violence as a method of control, humiliation, and dominance. While the myth of the chivalrous protector persists in popular culture, historical records and scholarly research consistently reveal that knights were often perpetrators of atrocities, particularly during and after sieges, when ordinary moral constraints were suspended under the logic of conquest. Once a town, village, or fortress fell, everything and everyone inside its walls was regarded as spoil, and women bore the brunt of that brutal reality. Rape was not an isolated crime. It was an extension of military victory, a deliberate act of psychological warfare that targeted both the individuals and the community at large. It functioned as a statement of total domination, where knights asserted their superiority not just through military conquest, but through bodily violation. The forced marriages of captured women, often framed euphemistically as war brides, further reveal how institutional this violence was. These marriages were rarely consensual and were often used to provide a legal facade for abduction and repeated assault. Knights who took women this way were not shamed. They were frequently praised for expanding their influence, especially when those unions came with land or local leverage. Church authorities, aware of the widespread abuse, attempted to introduce guidelines to regulate knightly conduct during campaigns. Canon law technically forbade rape, and clerics issued bulls demanding the protection of non-combatants. But these rules were largely symbolic. Enforcement was negligible, particularly when the perpetrators were high-ranking nobles or men whose military service shielded them from accountability. Victims had no platform, no legal recourse, and no institutional support. In most cases, they disappeared from the records entirely, absorbed into households as servants, hidden in monastic communities, or left destitute and socially ostracized. This silence was part of the system. The very structure of feudal warfare and noble privilege ensured that such crimes were overlooked, buried under rhetoric about honor, divine mission, and martial valor. Even contemporary chroniclers, when they did mention such acts, often minimized their severity or justified them as an unfortunate consequence of war. But the reality was clear. For many knights, sexual violence was not a deviation from their role, but a grim component of it. An accepted tactic of domination that laid bare the deep contradictions between chivalric ideals and the brutal, dehumanizing practices they too often concealed. Number 6. The use of torture and fear. The romanticized image of medieval knights, bound by honor and driven by righteousness, quickly falls apart when one examines their role not on the battlefield, but in the exercise of domestic power over those they ruled. As landed elites, knights often served as local authorities, tasked with maintaining order, resolving disputes, and enforcing justice. However, this justice was neither impartial nor humane. It was often a tool of domination, shaped more by personal interest and cruelty than by any consistent legal standard. Fear was a deliberate method of control, and torture functioned as both punishment and performance, an instrument that reinforced a knight's status, power, and invulnerability. Commonly used methods like the rack, where limbs were slowly dislocated, or branding, where hot iron seared symbols into flesh, weren't limited to state use. They were frequently applied at a knight's discretion. In many cases, knights constructed private dungeons in their keeps where they could imprison dissenters, rivals, or troublesome peasants without explanation or trial. These underground chambers became centers of unchecked violence, insulated from oversight and justified under vague accusations of theft, heresy, or insubordination. Executions were often public spectacles, designed not merely to punish but to remind entire communities of the knight's absolute authority. Burning, dismemberment, and slow suffocation were not aberrations, they were warnings. Justice under this regime was fundamentally hierarchical and unpredictable. A knight's word carried more weight than any evidence, and his personal sense of insult could result in lethal consequences. For peasants and lesser vassals, the very notion of a fair trial was a fiction. There were no defense lawyers, no appeals, no protection against bias. The power imbalance was staggering. Those trained for war were also the arbiters of justice, which created an environment where brutality was legitimized through authority. Even when religious institutions attempted to intervene, urging clemency or proportionality, such appeals were frequently ignored, especially when the violence served political or economic ends. Knights also used fear tactically, not just reactively. During times of unrest, rumors of harsh punishments were deliberately spread to preempt rebellion. This wasn't just about quelling crime, it was about eliminating opposition and asserting control through psychological domination. Entire villages could be punished for harboring fugitives or failing to pay tithes, and when resistance surfaced, it was crushed with exemplary force. In some regions, it became common practice for knights to stage mock trials before issuing predetermined sentences, giving the illusion of order while making clear that dissent would not be tolerated. Thus, the knightly image as a beacon of chivalry collapses under the weight of documented cruelty. Behind stone walls and ceremonial armor, Many knights operated less as noble guardians and more as autocrats who weaponized fear to preserve their social standing, wealth, and territorial command. Their version of justice was inseparable from violence, a system in which domination was enforced not through law, but through pain. Number 7. Obsession with dueling and ego. The notion that medieval knightly duels were acts of noble valor carried out according to strict codes of honor is a selective interpretation, one that ignores the volatile mixture of pride, insecurity, and unregulated aggression that actually fueled many of these encounters. Duels in the Middle Ages, while often wrapped in ceremonial formality, were not primarily about justice or resolution. They were deeply tied to the social identity of knights who constructed their status on perceived strength, public reputation, and a relentless need for personal validation. The culture surrounding knighthood demanded an image of invincibility, and this expectation bred a kind of paranoia, where any perceived insult or challenge to one's name required immediate, often violent, redress. What modern audiences might interpret as spontaneous acts of courage were frequently calculated performances, driven by ego and the fear of humiliation. A knight's public image was everything. To be seen as weak, hesitant, or dishonored could result in social ostracism, political sidelining, or loss of patronage. This led many to provoke or accept duels over trivial or even fabricated offenses. An offhanded remark, a misplaced banner, or an imagined slight could escalate into a lethal confrontation. In some cases, these confrontations were less about settling disputes and more about manufacturing visibility. Public duels, staged in marketplaces or castle courtyards, drew large audiences and functioned as a form of political theater. Knights used these spectacles to assert dominance, intimidate rivals, and attract the attention of powerful patrons or influential women. Wagers were placed, songs were composed afterward, and stories of exaggerated bravery circulated in courts and taverns alike. But the duels themselves were rarely as honorable as chroniclers or poets claimed. There are numerous accounts of poison being applied to weapons, of hidden allies waiting in ambush to intervene, or of knights bribing marshals to fix the outcome. Formal duels often followed inconsistent or manipulated codes, and many combatants came to the field with every intention of killing their opponent, not sparing them. Even religious or royal prohibitions against private combat had limited effect, as enforcement was weak and many lords privately encouraged duels when it served their interests. This behavior was not seen as dishonorable. It was often interpreted as cleverness or proof of ruthless capability. The same knight who might kneel for mass in the morning could be plotting the bloody downfall of a rival by noon. Number 8. Killing for sport and hunting humans. One of the more disturbing yet often overlooked aspects of medieval knighthood is the normalization of recreational violence, specifically the transformation of killing into a form of entertainment. While hunting was a respected and deeply ingrained part of noble life, serving both practical and symbolic purposes, for some knights, the line between traditional game hunting and sadistic blood sport was frighteningly thin. Hunting animals such as deer, boar, and wolves was not only a test of skill but a display of dominance over nature, a ritual that reinforced a knight's control and physical prowess. However, historical records and anecdotal accounts suggest that in certain circles, this appetite for blood extended to the use of human beings as prey, particularly those considered disposable criminals, deserters, or prisoners of war. In these so-called mock manhunts, individuals were released into woods or open terrain and given a head start, only to be chased down by mounted knights with hunting dogs, bows, or lances. These hunts were often dressed in the language of execution or punishment, but the underlying motive was not legal justice. It was spectacle and pleasure. Knights organized these events much like social gatherings, complete with attendants, squires, and even invited noble guests. Feasting, drinking, and storytelling followed, turning the entire event into a grotesque celebration of domination. Some nobles went so far as to develop reputations for these cruel displays, using them not only as a form of amusement, but as a method of projecting fear and authority. In a time when public executions were already a communal spectacle, such private acts of controlled brutality blurred the boundaries between justice and cruelty to an even greater extent. The practice reflected a broader cultural desensitization to violence that permeated knightly life. From early adolescence, future knights were immersed in an environment where pain, death, and physical superiority were valorized. When combined with absolute power over serfs and retainers, this mindset created conditions in which hunting human beings could be rationalized, if not morally, then at least socially, as a demonstration of noble prerogative. What makes these events particularly disturbing is not only their occurrence, but their relative acceptance within certain strata of medieval society. They were rarely condemned in contemporary sources, and when mentioned, often appeared in chronicles with a tone of amusement or grim fascination rather than horror. This silence reveals the underlying truth. In many parts of medieval Europe, the lives of the lower classes were so devalued that even their deaths could be turned into entertainment by those who wielded swords not just in war, but for pleasure. Number 9. Cults and secret orders. While the medieval knight is typically seen as a warrior in service to church and crown, some of the most powerful and enigmatic knightly orders operated more like closed societies, with their own codes, internal hierarchies, and rituals that would appear deeply alien even to other nobles of the time. The most famous example remains the Knights Templar, a military monastic order whose rapid rise in wealth and influence sparked both reverence and fear, but they were far from unique. Other lesser-known groups, such as the Teutonic Knights, the Order of the Dragon, the Hospitallers, and smaller regional orders, also cultivated a sense of separateness, defining their identity through rituals, oaths, and symbols designed to bind members through secrecy, loyalty, and sometimes fear. These organizations blurred the line between military brotherhoods and spiritual cults, merging religious authority with paramilitary power in a way that allowed them to operate independently of both monarchs and the church. Initiation into these orders was often a transformative event, not only symbolically, but psychologically. Accounts of elaborate initiation rites, some involving mock executions, prolonged isolation or symbolic death, and rebirth, were intended to strip new members of previous allegiances and reshape them into loyal instruments of the order. There are reports, some credible and others wrapped in myth, of initiates drinking from human skulls, swearing eternal silence on pain of death, or taking blood oaths to protect the secrets of the group even above allegiance to God or country. These practices, though hard to verify in every detail, were credible enough to provoke alarm from both religious leaders and kings, especially as certain orders amassed enormous landholdings, private armies, and even financial systems that rivaled those of states. The Templars in particular developed banking networks and a code-based communication system that made them nearly autonomous in international affairs. Their growing independence led to suspicion, culminating in their violent suppression under charges of heresy, sorcery, and idolatry, accusations that, while likely exaggerated or politically motivated, nonetheless reflected a broader anxiety about the power of such cloistered and elite organizations. Some knightly orders maintained private codes of conduct and jurisprudence that allowed them to disregard local laws, protect members from prosecution, or even intervene in religious disputes as self-declared moral arbiters. These powers made them both indispensable and deeply threatening to established hierarchies. Number 10. Fabricated glory and fake heroism. Much of what the modern world believes about medieval knights has less to do with fact and far more to do with deliberate myth-making, carefully constructed reputations shaped by the knights themselves or the clerical scribes they employed. These narratives weren't just harmless exaggerations, but intentional acts of historical distortion that influenced political power, legacy, and social status for centuries. Noble families often commissioned monks or court chroniclers to produce flattering accounts of their ancestors, paying handsomely to ensure that military blunders were rebranded as tactical retreats, acts of cruelty rewritten as divine justice, and cowardice omitted entirely. These chronicles were rarely objective. Instead, they functioned as instruments of legacy management, carefully shaping a lineage's public image to ensure continued respect and authority in a highly competitive feudal hierarchy. If a knight lost a campaign or retreated from battle, the story was often framed around betrayal, divine testing, or impossible odds rather than admitting to poor leadership or personal failure. In more egregious cases, entire episodes of violence against civilians, particularly during raids or sieges, were recast as holy retribution or necessary sacrifices in the name of a greater cause. This manipulation wasn't limited to events. Many knights also fabricated or embellished their genealogies, claiming descent from legendary warriors, Roman generals, or mythical crusaders to artificially inflate their noble standing. Heraldic symbols were sometimes designed not to reflect historical truth, but to invent ancestral valor where none existed. These symbols, in turn, reinforced the myths passed down through oral storytelling, visual art, and battlefield banners,